Yeah, Kari, you're a reporter and you're from Chicago. Is that how you got on this case to begin with? And who were you writing for at the time?
Well, yeah, so I covered it for the Washington Post. I was working for the Washington Post in the Midwest Bureau in Chicago. And this is kind of funny. I was doing some freelancing for People magazine, and they actually asked me to cover it too, which kind of shows how it blew up, because how often does People cover a labor story? Yeah, so, right. So it was a big deal. And then the publisher, Melville House, which I think are just wonderful, they had this idea of doing, they were calling it like crashing a book, just doing it really quickly and sort of doing it with the blog at the same time, you know, kind of putting my notes online. So they asked me just kind of through mutual acquaintances to do the project, and so yeah, that's how I ended up.
And how long did the dispute go on, beginning to the end?
Yeah, the actual occupation was only 5.5 days, but then the story just kind of kept going, because after the occupation, then they were trying to raise money for the worker-owned co-op, and then once they were bought by Serious Materials, they were still doing tours and doing a lot of, you know, solidarity work with workers and other struggles.
What effect did the Bank of America, they were part of the banks that got bailed out by the taxpayers.
Right.
What effect did that have on them sort of caving in on this?
I think it was all about that, because they were getting hammered, you know, in terms of their public image. And I mean, they'd gotten 25 billion, and then they got 20 billion more with the horrible takeover, you know, this like scandalous takeover of Merrill Lynch. So yeah, so they were, you know, just struggling, and this hit them out of the blue. They were already dealing with all sorts of, you know, public relations explosions because of the bailout stuff, and then they just didn't know what to make of these workers. You know, I think they were just completely baffled by it and caught off guard by it, which was interesting.
And could you hold your book up and tell us how you came to that title?
Well, yeah, so I mean, I think the publisher actually made up the title, but I like it. Goose Island is this island in the Chicago River that has a really neat history of its own. It was an industrial, you know, amazingly polluted, crazy place that was full of tanneries and factories back in the old days, and there was Irish and Scottish immigrants living and working there, and they raised geese, which is hence the Goose Island name. And right now, it's still this little industrial hub right in downtown Chicago, which who knows if this will work out, but city officials are trying to make it kind of the rebirth of industry in Chicago, which makes it, you know, extra significant that this thing happened there.
You said that close to 75% had come from Mexico, but there must have been a lot of blacks and a lot of whites, a little bit over 200 workers, right?
Yeah.
Must have been a lot of blacks and a lot of whites. How did that play out?
Stand up, Bill.
You know, in a lot of cases, places are organized kind of by department, and skilled workers, less skilled workers play in big. Gender, I don't know how many workers at Republic were women. And these are the kinds of things that in some cases make or break a situation like this. So could you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. And that was a really interesting thing about it. One of the many things. So it was roughly a quarter black workers, and there was probably a few white workers, but not many. I don't think I got to know any white workers. And definitely more men, but there were a significant enough number of women. And you know, I think like any workplace, it sounded like before this struggle, there were, you know, people that were really into the union and people that were, you know, less into it, and even a few who were kind of hostile to it. And there was backstory too, because to actually get the UE there, it previously had been represented by this horrible mob union that's a whole, you know, movie, real life movie in itself. So they'd had this big battle to actually get rid of, to decertify that union and bring in the UE. And there was, I think, some, you know, polarization, but also bringing people together around that struggle, which was 5 or 6 years before the occupation. So from what I understand, you know, I think like any workplace, there were people that were, you know, a lot more involved in the union, and I think it, for the most part, was the Latino workers that were more active in the union. But it did seem like this struggle really brought people together and really energized. Even some of the outright anti-union people became really gung-ho, you know, during the occupation, and I think it really did bring people together across, you know, lines of race, and I mean, there was a real family atmosphere there in terms of, you know, gender. Like a lot of the kids were in there during the occupation, men and women were talking about how proud their kids were of them, you know, being part of this and being on TV and, you know, having Obama talk about them. And then also in terms of being an immigrant workforce, it was a little different than, you know, probably a lot of factories in Chicago in that they had there was maybe a few recent immigrants, but most of them had been there for a good while, you know, 5 to up to like 30 years or more. So it wasn't like, you know, you're sort of very vulnerable transient immigrant workforce. Like they were really entrenched in this job, and so that probably contributed to just how hard people were going to fight for this. Yeah.
Anything further on the people who came from Mexico
Oh,
with
yeah.
regard to where they came from? Did they have a lot in common as to where they came from? Or what did they bring with them? Had they been involved in political or labor struggles back home? Or does any of that feed into it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And from what I gather, and you know, I didn't get to spend as much time with the workers as I would have liked, partly because the Blagojevich stuff was going on and I was having to cover that. But anyway, from what the time that I did spend with the workers, my impression was that, you know, probably more of them were from like northern Mexico, if anything, because just in larger demographic trends, you know, it's more the recent immigrants from southern Mexico and, you know, from the more impoverished areas of Mexico. So I think it was more people that had been in the area a long time and, you know, probably more from like north and central Mexico. And, you know, I was wondering, like a lot of people were, if they were directly inspired from factory occupations or, you know, militant actions in Mexico. And from what I gathered, not necessarily. I didn't meet anyone who had been part of some big action in Mexico. So I don't think it was so much a direct correlation, but I think there was just that consciousness. I mean, the fact that Armando was coming up with, you know, all these really bold ideas about what he would do before they came up with the factory occupation, I think that just shows a different mindset where even if you haven't been part of a big organized campaign, you're just more, you know, in Latin America, or I mean, I guess most other places besides the US and Europe, just living so much more on the edge where, you know, it's just more natural to respond in a real bold and militant way. And there were people from Argentina, you know, in contact with the workers. I don't think they'd had any contact with South America before necessarily, but there definitely were some bonds formed during the occupation. So. Mm-hmm.